Did you know that the Third Reich indirectly launched Ruger into being one of the best well known and respected gun companies in the United States? Now, it's fascinating when you look at the one pistol that started it all. So, I'm going to give you some of the highlights of Bill Ruger's journey here. And then I'm also going to tell you how much these pistols were back then and how much they are if you were to adjust them for inflation. A lot of this stuff is pretty crazy and shocking. So, if you like this type of content, consider subscribing. Let's go ahead and get into it. So Bill Ruger was always fascinated by firearms. There's a story that in the Brooklyn Library, he read every single book there was about guns. And during World War II, he was actually a military gun designer. And while his machine gun prototype wasn't accepted, it's still something that he had a really deep passion about. But it wasn't until 1949 where things started to take a turn for Bill Ruger. There was actually a Marine that brought him two baby Nambus from the Pacific Theater. Well, Bill Ruger was able to successfully copy this baby Nambu design, and that caught the attention of Alexander Sturm. Alexander Sturm is another interesting guy. He grew up in a wealthy family. I believe he went to Yale, and during World War II, he actually worked for the OSS, which is a predecessor to the CIA. A side character in this story is Ernst Hofsteingle. So essentially, this guy was an adamant supporter of Adolf Hitler. Went to Nazi party rallies, and after his very first one, he was just enamored by this guy. He thought he was the best speaker and there would never be another one that was as good as him in 10,000 years. That's until he fell out of favor with Hitler. Now, this kind of started as a dispute with Joseph Goebbels, but if you know anything about Hitler, if you ever fell out of favor with him, that was it. When you look at somebody like Rudolf Hess, who spent time with Hitler in prison and was with him from, basically the beginning, number three in line, fell out of favor with Hitler and went as far as to fly a solo mission to Scotland, get arrested, spent the rest of his life in jail in the last 20 years of his life as the only prisoner in Spandau prison. If you want to find more out about that, it is a really fascinating story, and apparently unalived himself at the age of 93, which I definitely don't believe. But regardless, I say all of that because if you fell out of Hitler's favor, then that was it. There was no coming back from that. So Hofsteingle actually was imprisoned by the British, sent over to Canada, and in 1941 started working with the OSS and Alexander Sturm because he had information on 400 Nazi leaders, including intimate details about Hitler himself. So kind of an interesting side character in all of this. And so after this, Bill Ruger, 1949, he gets these two Nambus from a Marine and is able to successfully copy them. Well, this catches the attention of Alexander Sturm, who provided the $50,000 seed money for Ruger to become what they did today. Unfortunately, Alexander Sturm never got to fully realize how successful this company would be because he died in 1951 at the age of 28 from hepatitis. So when you look at the eagle that is the logo of Ruger still to this day, it was actually on a red background. In 1952, they changed it to a black background to commemorate Alexander Sturm and the work he did in funding, Ruger's eventual success. Now, the Ruger Standard pistol became the cornerstone and still is to some extent to this day, of Ruger's success. And, according to Bill Ruger, he took the design of the Luger and he took aspects of the Colt Woodsman, which was designed by John Browning, but it's more so favors the Luger, which is kind of interesting. You think about George Luger, Bill Ruger, sound very similar, and the pistols look almost identical. You have that really crazy grip angle. You have kind of that tapered barrel look, and it doesn't use a toggle link system. But it is pretty fascinating when you look at all of these different characters and then George Luger's design that essentially saved Ruger. And that threw them, not only saved them, but threw them into being one of the most successful gun companies in the United States. And of course, that has spawned the Ruger Mark series, which, they have target versions of this gun, and it's just been wildly successful. And, it's changed over time. They have the 2245, which has more of a standard 1911 type of grip angle, but the Ruger Standard which is obviously a copy of the Luger, helped start this entire company, and Alexander Sturm was a big part of it as well. Now you may be thinking, well, why the Luger? Well, it's pretty simple. I mean, it was the most popular gun at the time, especially World War II and post World War II. You know, everybody wanted a Luger. You know, GIs went to great lengths to be able to get a trophy like this sent back home. And the Germans knew that, to the extent where they would actually booby trap some Lugers for unsuspecting GIs. And so this was a hot item in the European theater. Now, when Ruger introduced this, at the time there was only two 22 manufacturers. You had the Colt Woodsman and you had the High Standard. When this came out, it was $37.50. Not this gun, this is a Luger, but you know what I'm saying. $37.50, which is half the cost of the Colt Woodsman and less than the cheapest High Standard that you could buy at the time. Now, when you adjust this for inflation today, $37.50 is like $465 back then, which means a Colt Woodsman back then was $900 plus, which is insane. You know, when you think about the 50s and the 60s and even before, you think, man, these stuff was like, I would have bought 200 of these things at the time. But that's not how it was. When you have an average medium family income of like, might have been $6,400 back then or something, that was a good amount of money. I mean, that was like 10% of your income. So the fact that these were half the cost of that and cheaper than all of the rest of the competition was pretty significant, but not as cheap as you may think. Now, I tell this story because I find it fascinating. When you see these, these guys that just, put it all on the line, and for Ruger especially, starting in 1949, essentially competing with Smith & Wesson and Colt and Remington and Winchester, all these companies that had like 100 years of advantages before Ruger, and Ruger is now one of the biggest manufacturers in the world. So it is a pretty awesome and crazy story. And so the German Luger helped launch one of the best known companies in America today. That's the story, man. I'd love to hear anything that may have shocked you about this story, or any other gun stories maybe you want to hear me kind of research and do a video on. If you like what we do, consider subscribing. And if you want to support us further, you can do that on Patreon, or you can join the channel right here. Get some pretty cool perks along the way. Big thanks to you guys. See you in the next one. And as always, hold them down.